Hello, is this Mr. Halloway? The voice was small, almost drowned by the noise of traffic, yet it cut straight through. Clear, frightened, but honest. Victor Halloway glanced at his phone unknown number. He never answered those, but something in his chest made him swipe. Speaking. "Who is this?" he asked. A pause. Then a trembling whisper. "I'm sorry to call, but your son is in an alley. He's not moving. There's blood." Victor's heart dropped. He rose so suddenly his chair crashed against the wall, board members staring. His assistant gasped, "What did you just say?" The girl sniffed, her voice cracking but steady. "Some boys attacked him. They ran. I didn't want him to be alone. Please. Come quickly." Victor didn't even hang up properly. He was already running. The first snow of Detroit came sideways, flung by a wind that slipped along the brick spines of warehouses and whistled through the chain links of the night market's back lot. Orion hung like a bent nail in the sky. The market light's cheap bulbs, strung in tired triangles, sputtered against the cold and threw a yellow hush over crates of bruised apples, imitation perfume, and the last of the hot sausages wrapped in foil. Beyond the buzz and barter, a narrow service alley ran behind the stalls, a sliver of city where the world folded in on itself. Trash cans with metal ribs, a dented dumpster wearing graffiti like old tattoos, a drain grating that gurgled with melted snow and secrets. Lila Carter turned into that alley because she always did, because it was a shortcut to the building where she lived with her grandmother, because the faster route meant Edna didn't worry as long, and because she liked the alley's ugly honesty better than the market's pretend sparkle. Lila was 9 and small for it, a skinny black girl with knobby wrists and a red knit hat her grandmother had unraveled from a sweater and re-knit into something brave. Her hair, tight coils normally held back by blue elastics, had escaped under the hat in a halo of defiance. She wore a thrift store pea coat 2 sizes too big, sleeves cuffed 3 times, and purple high tops she had sharpied with lightning bolts. The laces were mismatched. One had broken last winter, and the replacement came from a bag of leftovers the church gave out. Her face had the narrow angles of a sparrow, and the stubborn eyes of someone who had already learned the world would not come knocking with kindness if you didn't call first. People said she was watchful. The truth, Lila kept inventory of exits, of strangers' hands, of whether the snow was sticking to the asphalt or just kissing and running. She carried those inventories like other kids carried dolls. At the mouth of the alley, a dog lifted its head. It was a winter-thin mutt the color of toast crumbs, ears ragged from alley verdicts, eyes the gold of sweet tea. The dog didn't bark, just watched her the way old men in bus stations do, as if to say, "You again?" Lila called him Sir, not because he acted important, but because he seemed to remember a time when someone had said his name with care. Sir sniffed the cold, sneezed, and curled back into himself behind a stack of pallets where the wind couldn't pry him open. Lila's breath smoked as she moved deeper into the narrow. Somewhere back in the market, a vendor laughed like he was coughing. A radio tuned to a Motown station warbled through static, and the alley collected the sound like a shell collects the sea. Lila was halfway down between a mural of a lion with flaking paint and the sickly pallor of a floodlit loading dock when she saw the boy. He lay folded against the base of a brick wall, as if the city had tried to tuck him away and failed halfway through. One arm was flung overhead, the other was crooked tight against his ribs. A smear of dark, half-frozen blood crept from his hairline into the shallow ice of a puddle. His hoodie was expensive, the kind with a small stitched emblem you couldn't afford to look at too long, and his sneakers were the kind that came in boxes that smelled like velvet and merit. His skin, a milk pail that made the bruising bloom in hectic violets along his cheekbone, reflected the market's jaundiced light. His mouth was parted, breath so shallow she had to crouch and listen to the cold to find it. He was maybe her age, maybe 10 if you squinted, but he wore money like a second face even with his first one turned off. Lila slowed as if entering church. The night zipped itself tighter. She had walked past sleeping men on steam grates and weeping women in borrowed coats. She had walked past fights, some loud, some bored, and she had always kept moving because keeping moving kept you alive. But this boy's breath was a whisper, and his blood was a question, and Lila's head filled with a grief that had a name and a birthday. Jairus. He had been 7 and loud with it, all elbows and schemes, a boy who believed every alley held treasure and every person held a story he could fix by listening hard enough. One summer afternoon, how dare summer be part of it, he had fallen off a back-of-truck ladder chasing a paper airplane he swore carried a wish. The world had slowed into honey. The nearest adult had said, "Wait for the ambulance." The ambulance had snarled somewhere far away like a bad promise. The sun had been too bright on everything. Lila had knelt by her brother and counted breaths for a God that counted differently. And afterward the world had returned to its usual speed as if it hadn't broken anything she couldn't glue. Since then, Lila had learned that wishes were birds with molasses on their wings. Now she knelt again, but she was not that version of herself anymore. "Hey," she said to the boy. It came out small and stern. She touched his shoulder with 2 fingers like maybe he was a spell and she could lift it. He didn't stir. She saw a phone sleek crack spiderwebbing the glass spilled from the pocket of his hoodie. His knuckles were scuffed. There was a long scrape down one shin where denim was now furred white with threads. The alley said there had been other boys, the way snow said the wind had already told its stories elsewhere. Lila looked back toward the market. People were still buying their almosts. She looked at Sir the dog. He had lifted his head again and was watching her with one eye, as if he knew the next minute would decide what kind of person she was going to be when she grew up. Lila picked up the phone. The screen recognized a face that wasn't hers and sulked, but the emergency call option pulsed at the bottom like a heartbeat. Lila hesitated. Ambulances were loud and slow. They were also expensive, and expensive sometimes meant questions that took children away from home and put them under fluorescent lights that hummed like bees. Her grandmother's voice arrived in her mind, full of stubborn music. "Child, do right, even when right is costly." She pressed 911 with a thumb that had been chapped since October. As she waited for the call to connect, the screen bloomed with a notification. "Missed call. Dad." Another blinked up. "Car on the way." The contact photo was a man's profile in a tux that pretended it didn't want to be noticed. The name under it was Victor Halloway. Lila didn't know that name the way CEOs intended themselves to be known by articles and quarterly reports and the way other men tugged their ties when they said it. She knew the name because sometimes the news played at the bodega and a crawl would say Halloway Ventures, and a man with white hair would be talking about the future as if it were a pet he'd trained. Rich folk were like constellations. You learned their shapes because they watched you whether you watched back or not. "Emergency dispatch," a woman's voice said, flat with the skill of people who look at 1,000 worse days and go back to their lunch anyway. Lila gave the location the alley off Willow Street behind the winter market, near the mural with the lion that had lost an eye and the cold details. Boy, head wound, breathing shallow. The dispatcher asked for a callback number, and Lila, without a number to give that wouldn't lead questions back to Edna, recited the one on the screen. When the call ended, Lila's thumb hovered over Victor Halloway, and a voice in her rooted belly said, "Don't wait this time." She pressed. It rang a long time, as if crossing some rich person orbit took extra seconds by law. The boy made a small sound, like a line being tugged on a fishing rod. The market's radio swung into "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," the trumpets trying to be warm. Lila counted the rings, because counting was how you held your breath without dying. On the 8th, the call clicked and opened on a silence too expensive to have background noise, and then a man said, "Yes?" "This is Victor." Lila's throat surprised her. She'd meant to be practical. She'd meant to be nothing but facts. But Jairus's name, which she did not say, pushed into the space and made room, and her voice came out tiny and fierce. "Mr. Halloway, your son is hurt. He's in an alley by the Willow Street market. He's breathing, but..." She swallowed. "He's bleeding bad." There are moments when even a billionaire's blood obeys the same physics as yours, and one found Victor then. He sucked in air. A chair somewhere knocked a wall. Lila could hear the glass echo of a high floor, the distant hush of many people suddenly pretending they weren't listening. "Where exactly?" he said, the words like stepping stones over a river. She painted the alley with language dumpster, lion mural, the smell of hot oil and cold iron, and in the space between them the night market shivered toward clarity. "Stay with him," Victor said. It wasn't a command the way men with money usually commanded. It was a plea that had forgotten to make itself pretty. "I'm coming." Lila stuffed the phone between her shoulder and her ear and pressed both hands over the boy's scalp the way a neighborhood nurse had taught her once when a man outside the liquor store took the wrong kind of fall. Blood warmed her fingers, then cooled as the wind edited everything back toward winter. "You hear that?" she told the boy. "Your dad's coming. Try to breathe big. Big is better than small." He didn't answer with words, but his throat made that line-tugging sound again, and she decided to count it as obedience. Sir got up and paced 3 steps closer, then stopped, testing whether this was a story he was allowed to join. "Stay," Lila told him, which was funny because she had just broken the rule about not telling anyone to stay, because in her life, they never did. The dog sat, tail making a slow punctuation mark against the concrete. "Tell me your name," Victor said in her ear, after a rustle that sounded like doors and people and a life rearranging itself without her seeing. "Lila Carter," she said. "I'm 9. Saying 9 felt like laying down a badge that said, "You can't blame me for not being taller." "Lila," he said, and her name in his mouth didn't sound like charity or suspicion. "Thank you." There was motion at the street end of the alley. 2 boys in quilted jackets slowed and looked, registering the kind of trouble that didn't come from shopkeepers and pocketed apples. They were all edges and hollowness, eyes scanning for weakness the way other kids scanned for amusement. Lila stiffened and widened her elbows without lifting her hands, making herself large in the way cats do when they figure theater is half of war. The boys looked away first. The market's security guard, a Puerto Rican man with a peppermint cough named Manny, stepped into view a moment later, a sideways cap pulled down to his ears. Manny was in his late 30s, with a belly that said he'd won a few battles and lost none he regretted. His mustache was trimmed with the precision of a promise. "Yo, little Carter," he said, voice set to calm. "You all right?" His eyes slid to the boy, paused, recalculated everything. "Ambulance is coming," Lila said. He hit his head. Manny came closer and knelt. He had hands the size of plates, but he kept them floating inches from the boy, like he knew about magic you shouldn't touch. "You did good," he said without waiting to see if the world agreed. To the phone at her ear, he said, "This the dad?" "She's keeping pressure. Kid's got breath sounds, pupils reactive." Manny knew a lot, because Manny had been a paramedic once before a choice, and a luck made him a night market guard. "I'm in the car," Victor said, and Lila heard the thrum of something large and impatient. 5 minutes out. There was a second voice on his side, a woman brisk and exacting, an assistant unspooling logistics like thread. "We're coordinating with St. Jerome's ER, the woman said, not to Lila. "Security notified. Press mitigation begun." Lila didn't know what mitigation meant, but she recognized the cadence of someone smoothing napkins at a table the wind was about to steal. Victor lowered his voice. "Lila, are you still warm?" "Warm enough," she lied because the cold had teeth, and now that adrenaline had burned small and bright, the teeth found the meat. He said, "There's a scarf in the bag in my trunk. When I arrive, I'll—" He stopped and exhaled at his own uselessness. "Stay with him." "Keep talking to me." She did. She told him the name of the sausage guy with the kind eyes who always threw in extra peppers, and the way the alley puddle carried a thin skin of ice that looked like cracked glass even though it wasn't, and how her grandma could guess the weather by how the arthritis in her hands played the piano, and how sometimes the market smelled like cinnamon and old pennies. She told him the boy's eyelashes were stupid long and that it wasn't fair how boys never had to earn eyelashes. She told him she had once seen a hawk from the school bus, right there above the freeway, and that it had lifted a mouse like a miracle. She told him she had been mad at the miracle because the mouse had wanted its life too. She talked because words did what blankets sometimes couldn't. "Tell me about your grandmother," Victor said, and she did. Edna Carter, 68, black woman built like a steeple and a quilt at the same time, who smelled like ivory soap and Vicks and kitchen courage, who told stories of the South like it was a person who had broken her heart and still called sometimes. Edna had once sung in a choir that made strangers cry and had once loved a man who made her laughter hitch like a hiccup. She had stopped singing when Jairus died and started again last month, softer. She had worked at a factory until the factory moved to somewhere a map couldn't help you with, had cleaned houses until her back told the truth louder than bills, had taught Lila to read using psalms and cream cheese labels. "She's sick," Lila said finally, "because the truth will bleed through a lie like dye. It's not dangerous sick most days. Just slow sick. The kind that steals spoons in afternoons." "I'm sorry," Victor said, and Lila liked that he didn't decorate it. Sir crept 2 more steps, and Manny side-eyed the dog with the respect of one survivor to another. "He's fine," Lila said. "He don't bite unless you're meat." Manny huffed. "We're all meat, kid." "I mean, never mind." There are sirens a city learns to predict by the way the air flinches. This one arrived like a long breath Lila had been accidentally holding since summer. An ambulance, paint too clean for the neighborhood, light stuttering red over old snow. The alley filled with purpose boots and a jump bag and the tang of antiseptic that smells like right decisions. The paramedic who slid out first was a woman with a braid so tight it might have been a plan. Her name tag said R. Henley. She was late 20s, skin like cafe au lait, eyes bright enough to warm a room if she let them. "Talk me through it," she said to Lila, landing in a crouch so neat it should have had choreography credits. Lila did. Robin Henley listened without interrupting, which made her rare and valuable. She peeled Lila's hands gently away to check the wound, replaced them with gauze and practiced pressure, shined a penlight. "Good work," she said, like a medal. "You kept him here. That matters." Her partner, a husky white guy with winter cheeks and soft forearms named Dev Patel Devon on the tag, Dev in the mouth of everyone who loved him, brought the stretcher. Dev was a Detroit kid who'd grown into a Detroit man, barrel-chested from hockey and humility, early 30s, married to a woman who taught 6th grade math and believed fractions were a moral test. He wore kindness like other men wore cologne. They loaded the boy with a gentleness that made the alley seem like it had a ceiling after all. A black SUV slid to the curb at the alley's mouth and a man got out so fast the air didn't catch up. Victor Halloway was taller than his photos had implied, but some heights are made of posture. He was in his early 50s, white, with a face that had learned how to be photographed from angles that didn't betray it. Silver threaded his close-cropped hair. He wore a charcoal coat that had never before been asked to learn the vocabulary of an alley. His features were cut to look decisive from across a boardroom table, but up close there were tired brackets around his mouth and the unexpected softness of eyes that had once cried hard and quietly. The hand he raised ran into the invisible wall of paramedic protocol and fell, empty, to his side. He accepted this with the numb obedience of a father. The wind went around him as if even weather had been trained to accommodate. "Dad?" The boy on the gurney. Noah found the strength for a syllable. His voice had a burr of private school and a hitch of pain. Victor bent, the joints of his whole life creaking, and touched the air near his son. "I'm here." It was not a promise. It was a confession. Lila stood back, suddenly aware that her hat was too red and her coat had someone else's name sharpied on the inside. Manny, reading embarrassment like a headline, put a hand the size of Providence lightly on her shoulder. Victor's gaze lifted and found Lila because sometimes the world insists on telling the truth plainly. He took in the smallness of her, the smudged cheeks, the broken-in shoes, the stubborn chin. For a moment, Confusion and thanks and fear braided themselves into something he didn't have a word for. He stepped toward her as if approaching a fragile instrument, and then stopped, manners catching waist-deep in panic. "You're Lila," he said, more prayer than question. She nodded, chin up, because she'd learned early that apology without cause is a currency that buys nothing. He looked like a man memorizing. "Thank you." Robin Henley's voice cut clean through the wind. "We need to move, Mr. Halloway." The doors of the ambulance yawned open like a jaw. Victor looked from Noah to Lila to the yawning van of consequence and then made the first decent choice of his second life. "Ride with him," he told the medics, stepping back. "I'll follow." Then to Lila, can you... He swallowed, and the rich veneer cracked just enough to show the animal underneath. "Stay with him until I get there?" Lila glanced at Manny, because you always asked a witness to your decisions to stand with them afterward if they went wrong. Manny nodded, mustache tipping toward a smile that wasn't silly at all. "Go on, little Carter. The boys who did this don't get to make you scared of ambulances forever." Lila climbed into the back of the vehicle and sat on the narrow bench, hands in her lap, fingers still smelling like pennies in winter. Sir barked once, a small oath, and trotted to the edge of the alley where he could watch the lights disappear. The doors thudded shut like a gavel. The ambulance pulled away, its siren spilling color and alarm up the throat of Willow Street. Snow began again, finer this time, as if the sky had decided to reconsider its approach. Victor stood in the alley long enough for the wind to find the seams of his coat. Then he pressed the heels of his hands hard against his eyes, as if he could force a different beginning out of them, and when he dropped his hands, his face looked the same and not at all. Behind him, the night market kept pretending to be cheerful. Ahead of him, the city opened its roads like lines in a poem you could read two ways and be right both times. He turned toward his car, toward the hospital, toward the part of the story where power meant something other than winning. In the back of the ambulance, Lila leaned forward and said to the boy very softly, as if telling a secret to the dark, "Don't worry. I won't leave you." And she didn't. Victor Halloway had built his life among glass and steel, the upper floors of Detroit's tallest tower, where boardrooms smelled of leather chairs and polished ambition. From those heights, the city looked small, its scars softened by distance. At 52, Victor wore his age like a weapon sharpened by experience, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair trimmed to silver precision, his jaw square with years of public photographs. His tailored charcoal suit had been cut in London to remind everyone in the room that he was both successful and untouchable. Yet at that moment, standing at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by directors, bankers, and advisors, he felt anything but untouchable. The call still echoed inside his chest, a child's trembling voice saying his son was bleeding in an alley. Victor's reputation had been built on caution, never answering unknown numbers, never allowing chaos into controlled space. But something in that fragile honesty had struck him harder than any hostile takeover. The boardroom had frozen when he shoved back his chair, the legs scraping like accusation across the marble floor. Around the table sat men and women who lived off his decisions. Closest to him was Jonathan Pierce, his chief financial officer. Jonathan was in his early 60s, balding with a careful ring of gray hair, spectacles perched low on his nose. He had the patient eyes of a man who measured everything twice before speaking. "Victor?" he asked, voice steady, but his fingers tightened on a fountain pen. Jonathan had weathered decades beside Victor, the loyal lieutenant who believed stability was the empire's spine. Beside him was Evelyn Grant, head of communications. In her 40s, slender, with hair the color of copper wires cut to her chin, Evelyn had a reputation for keeping disasters from becoming headlines. She wore sharp suits in muted tones, her nails always painted in neutral polish. Once, in her 20s, she had been a field reporter covering a factory fire. She had watched smoke choke the skyline and had promised herself never again to stand powerless. Now she crafted narratives with surgical precision. Her gaze on Victor now was quick and calculating, already scanning for damage control. The room was filled with others directors in dark suits, analysts in crisp ties, secretaries clutching tablets. All watched as Victor stood, phone clenched in one hand like an uninvited ghost. His heart, a machine long tuned to the rhythm of profits, stumbled. "My son," he said, the words tasting foreign in a space designed for numbers. He didn't offer more. He didn't explain. He simply left. The glass door slammed behind him, leaving silence and a scattering of anxious looks. Jonathan rose halfway from his chair but sat back when Evelyn touched his sleeve, whispering, "Let him go. This isn't our battlefield." The elevator ride felt eternal. Victor's reflection in the mirrored walls looked like a stranger, the cold eyes of a billionaire cracked by fear. His driver, Marcus Doyle, was already waiting downstairs. Marcus was in his mid-40s, a former Marine with a build like a brick wall, skin the shade of coffee, and a clean-shaven head that gleamed under the lobby lights. He had been with Victor nearly a decade, trusted for his silence more than his driving. Marcus's loyalty came from more than a paycheck years ago. Victor had quietly funded a prosthetics program for veterans, something Marcus's brother had benefited from. That debt bound him in ways unspoken. "Hospital?" Marcus asked, opening the door of the sleek black SUV. "Not yet," Victor said, his voice gravel. "Willow Street Market. An alley there. Step on it." Marcus didn't question. Tires screamed as the car surged into traffic, weaving past yellow cabs and delivery trucks. Detroit at night was a tangle of neon and shadow, the market district glowing like a stubborn candle. As they drove, Victor pressed the phone harder against his ear, demanding updates from the girl. Each tremor in her voice sliced through his armor. He imagined his son Noah, only 11, with his mother's quiet smile lying in the dirt of an alley Victor had never considered part of his city. Noah had grown up in private schools and manicured lawns. The idea of him bleeding beside dumpsters felt like blasphemy. Evelyn's number lit the screen. He answered with a growl. "Victor," she said briskly, "if this gets out before we control the narrative—" "Not now," he snapped, harsher than he intended. Evelyn inhaled but did not argue. She knew when words could be gasoline. "Understood. Call me when you can." The line went dead. Traffic snarled near the market, horns blaring, headlights glaring like accusations. Marcus took a side street, the SUV bouncing over potholes. As they neared, Victor's chest tightened. Sirens wailed ahead, ambulance lights washing the brick walls crimson. When the SUV halted, Victor leapt out before the wheels fully stopped. Cold wind slapped his face, sharp with the scent of fried oil and snow. He pushed through a small crowd gathered at the alley's mouth. Vendors in aprons, teenagers with wide eyes, a woman holding her grocery bag like a shield. At the alley's end he saw it. The ambulance. Doors open like wings. Medics moved with precision, voices clipped. And there, his son, Noah, strapped to a stretcher, pale against the night. Victor staggered forward, but a medic blocked him gently. "Sir, we need space." The medic was Darius Holmes, mid-30s, African-American, with dreadlocks tied back neatly. His broad frame radiated calm authority, eyes steady from years of pulling people back from edges. Darius had once lost his own brother to street violence, a pain that made him fight harder for every patient. Now he guided Victor back a step. "He's stable enough to move. Let us do our job." Victor's eyes burned. For years he had wielded power that bent cities, but here he was just another father begging for a chance. His gaze caught the girl then, small, bundled in an oversized coat, her red hat tilted. Lila. She stood with shoulders squared, refusing to shrink even though she looked no taller than fear itself. The dog from the alley, sir, lingered behind her like a sentinel. Something broke open inside Victor at the sight. This was the voice that had pierced his walls. A stranger child had stood guard where the world had failed. He wanted to speak, but words lodged in his throat. "Stay with him until I get there," he had asked her on the phone. And she had. The stretcher slid into the ambulance. Victor tried again to follow, but Darius shook his head. One ride only. She's already inside. He meant Lila. Victor froze, torn between pride and dismay. His son was leaving with a girl he'd never met, in a world he had never touched. He turned toward Marcus, who hovered near the SUV, jaw tight. "Follow them," Victor ordered. Marcus nodded once, already sliding into the driver's seat. Victor climbed in, slammed the door, and let himself collapse against the leather. For the first time in years, he felt small. The city outside blurred into streaks of light and darkness, every passing block a reminder that he had spent his life building walls high enough to forget alleys existed. Now the alleys had claimed his son. And Victor Halloway, the man who never answered unknown calls, realized he would never again hear a phone ring the same way. The ambulance roared through Detroit's arteries, its siren tearing a path through winter-dark streets. Inside, the fluorescent glow turned faces into ghosts. Noah strapped to the gurney, pale but stubbornly alive, medics working in quiet rhythm, and Lila Carter perched on the side bench with her legs swinging just above the floor. Her coat was soaked at the sleeves, her small hands raw from pressing on Noah's wound, and her teeth tapped against each other like a stuttering metronome. She kept her eyes locked on the boy, as though her attention alone could tether him to the world. When they reached St. Jerome's Hospital, the back doors banged open and the cold rushed in again. Nurse Marianne Fletcher took charge, signaling the gurney forward. Marianne was in her early 50s, broad-shouldered with a kind face that years of night shifts had carved into furrows of fatigue. She wore her gray hair in a practical bun, and her dark blue scrubs carried faint stains that never washed out. She had once lost her own daughter to pneumonia because she couldn't afford medicine at the time. Since then, she carried a relentless mission. No child left unseen. Her voice was brisk but motherly as she barked orders at the staff and swept Noah into the trauma bay. Lila stumbled after them, but Marianne held up a hand. "Sweetheart, you need to wait here a moment." Lila froze, her back against the cold tile wall, shivering as though the warmth of the hospital refused to accept her. She wasn't used to sterile hallways or people in crisp uniforms moving with purpose. The hum of machines, the echo of hurried footsteps, it was another universe. Victor arrived seconds later, breath clouding from the sprint indoors. His suit looked absurd here, like armor dragged into the wrong battlefield. He spotted Lila immediately, a small figure with a red hat askew, coat frayed at the hem, shoes waterlogged. Her lips were turning blue, but her eyes, sharp, unwavering, met his without apology. "You stayed with him," Victor said, his voice hoarse. "Yes, sir," Lila whispered, hugging herself. Her chin lifted as if bracing for him to accuse her of something she hadn't done. Victor's eyes softened, though he didn't know how to show it. For a man used to boardrooms, gratitude felt awkward, like speaking in a language he hadn't practiced. He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, immaculate white linen, and held it out. Lila hesitated, then shook her head. She didn't want pity disguised as silk. In that moment, Dr. Samuel Tran strode into the hallway. He was a tall man in his late 30s, half Vietnamese, half Irish, with close-cropped black hair and sharp cheekbones. His green eyes were alert, carrying the calm of someone who had rehearsed emergencies thousands of times. A faint scar trailed along his right forearm, an old car accident in his residency days that had nearly ended his career. Since then, he carried an unshakable sense that every second mattered. "Mr. Halloway," he greeted briskly, already gloved and focused. "Your son is stable but concussed. We'll run a CT to rule out internal bleeding." He glanced at Lila, then back to Victor. "Is she family?" Victor opened his mouth, hesitated. "She's the one who called me." She stayed with him. Dr. Tran nodded once. Respect, not condescension. Then he disappeared into the trauma bay. For the next half hour, Victor paced the waiting room. The sterile air seemed designed to strip power from men like him. On one side sat a janitor in overalls dozing against his mop. On the other, a young mother with a crying toddler bounced nervously. Victor, used to commanding skyscrapers, now felt leveled to the same ground as everyone else. He hated it and needed it. Across the room, Lila sat alone in a plastic chair, knees drawn to her chest. She looked like a child waiting to be scolded. Victor lowered himself into the seat beside her, his coat draping like a curtain between them and the rest of the world. "Tell me your name again," he said gently. "Lila Carter," she answered. Her voice was steady, though her fingers twisted in her lap. "Do you have someone I can call for you?" "Parents?" "My grandma," she said after a pause. "Her name's Edna. She don't always pick up. Phone's old. Sometimes no minutes left." Victor studied her small, defiant, carrying burdens that bent her shoulders too soon. He thought of Noah, who had never worried about minutes on a phone, who had always had someone answering. At that very hour, in a 2-room apartment 4 blocks away, Edna Carter stirred in her bed. She was 68, her once powerful frame now thinned by illness, gray hair tucked beneath a scarf. Her face carried both tenderness and stubborn lines carved by years of factory labor. She had been coughing all night, chest rattling like loose glass. On the chipped nightstand sat unpaid bills, a half-used bottle of cough syrup, and a Bible with worn edges. Edna had raised Lila after her daughter. Lila's mother disappeared into the haze of addiction. Now her failing health chained her to the apartment, while Lila played both granddaughter and caretaker. Back at the hospital, a nurse offered Lila a cup of hot chocolate from a vending machine. The styrofoam cup steamed, but Lila only held it between her hands, as if heat alone could fix the fractures of her world. The double doors of the trauma bay swung open. Dr. Tran stepped out, removing his gloves. "He's stable," he announced. Relief loosened Victor's spine. "You can see him," Dr. Tran added. He gestured toward the room. Inside, Noah lay with an IV in his arm, monitors beeping gently. His eyelids fluttered, lashes long against pale cheeks. Victor sat at his side, his hand trembling as he clasped his son's. A shadow shifted near the door. Lila, standing uncertainly. She didn't step closer until Noah stirred. His eyes cracked open, dazed, confused, but then they found her. His hand twitched, reaching weakly. "Don't. Leave," he murmured, voice thin but urgent. Lila froze. She had been planning to slip away, to vanish before anyone could accuse her of clinging to wealth not hers, but Noah's words bound her to the floor. Her heart lurched the last time she'd heard those words. They had been from Jairus, her little brother, on the day he died. Victor watched the exchange, a knot forming in his chest. His son, bruised and fragile, clung not to him, but to a girl from an alley. The irony burned, but so did the truth. Sometimes loyalty came from strangers, not blood. Victor cleared his throat, forcing control back into his voice. "Lila," he said, "you've done more than anyone tonight. You don't have to stay if you don't want to." But Noah's hand was still reaching. Lila moved to his bedside, sat gingerly on the edge of the mattress, and wrapped her small fingers around his. "I won't," she whispered. The monitors beeped steady, as if confirming the promise. Victor leaned back, silent. For the first time in years, the powerful father didn't know what came next. Morning bled slowly into the sterile windows of St. Jerome's Hospital, a gray Detroit dawn that made the city look tired rather than alive. The storm from the night before had left dirty slush lining the curbs, and in the lobby, reporters already circled like vultures. They had sniffed out the scent of scandal, a billionaire, his wounded son, and a ragged girl pulled from a back alley. Upstairs, Victor Halloway sat stiffly in a hospital chair beside Noah's bed. His suit jacket had been shed, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed by sleepless hours. Noah dozed lightly, his hand still clasped around Lila's smaller one. Lila herself was half asleep, curled in the chair nearest the window, the red hat slipping to her shoulder. The cheap blanket Marianne the nurse had found barely covered her. She looked too small for the room, like a sparrow that had flown into a cathedral. Victor studied her with the wary curiosity of a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. He knew the statistics, poverty, neglect, the machinery of broken homes, but until last night they had remained abstract, filed away in reports or philanthropic proposals. Now poverty had a face, chapped lips, bruised sneakers, a stubborn chin. He learned more than he expected when social worker Angela Monroe arrived that morning. Angela was in her late 40s, tall and willowy, with streaks of silver running through her coiled black hair. She wore a simple navy coat and carried a folder bulging with forms. Her voice was calm, almost musical, but her gaze was sharp, shaped by years of watching children slip through cracks no one wanted to admit existed. Once, early in her career, she had failed to save a boy who ended up lost to the system. Since then, she had promised never again to let a child vanish without a fight. Angela introduced herself to Victor with a polite nod. Then she crouched beside Lila. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you some questions about home." "About who takes care of you?" Lila stiffened. "My grandma does." "Edna Carter. She's sick, but she's all I got." Angela scribbled notes, her brow tightening. "And where is she now?" "At home," Lila muttered, pulling the blanket tighter. "She can't walk much." "She don't leave the apartment." Victor watched the exchange, the words sinking into him like stones. This girl was balancing between childhood and survival, holding up her grandmother's fragile world with her own small hands. Before he could speak, the hospital room door cracked open again. Reporter Brian Keller slipped in, ignoring the nurse's protests. He was mid-30s, lean, with an untidy mop of brown hair and a jacket too thin for the weather. His eyes burned with ambition, the kind of man who smelled stories the way hounds smelled blood. Years earlier, his career had faltered after publishing an unverified exposé that cost him credibility. He'd been clawing his way back ever since, and a billionaire entangled with a mystery girl was the kind of story that could resurrect him. "Mr. Halloway," Brian's voice carried false cheer. "Care to comment on why a girl from Willow Street Market just happens to be at your son's bedside?" "Some say this looks staged." He aimed his recorder forward. "A PR stunt to soften your reputation?" Victor's jaw tightened. The old instinct to control, to crush rose in him. But before he could answer, Lila shot upright, her face pale but fierce. "It wasn't staged," she burst out. "He was bleeding and nobody else would stop. I called because—" her voice cracked. "Because I didn't want him to die." Brian's brows lifted, surprised at the outburst. But the damage was done. Words already framed the story in suspicion. Cameras would repeat them without mercy. Angela stepped between them, her voice cold. "This is a hospital, not your newsroom." "Leave, Mr. Keller." With the nurse's help, she ushered him out, though not before his smirk promised tomorrow's headlines. The air in the room thickened with unease. Victor sat back heavily. For decades he had lived on reputation, and he knew how fragile it could be. If the world painted this girl as a pawn in his game, the narrative could destroy both of them. The tension snapped when two uniformed figures appeared at the door, representatives from Child Protective Services. One was a broad-chested man named Officer Randall Briggs, mid-50s, with thinning blonde hair and a face red from cold. His eyes were tired, but not unkind. He had raised 4 children of his own, and the job weighed on him. Beside him stood caseworker Teresa Diaz, early 30s, petite with olive skin and dark hair in a severe bun. Teresa was precise, efficient, and carried herself with the authority of someone who had learned to armor compassion behind procedure. She had seen too many children trapped in unsafe homes and carried the scars of constant second-guessing. "Mr. Halloway," Teresa said politely but firmly, "we need to take the girl into protective custody until we confirm her guardianship and her grandmother's condition." The words dropped like stones. Lila's eyes went wide. "No!" she cried, scrambling back against the bed. "You can't! If you take me, who's going to take care of Grandma? She can't even walk to the store. If you take me, she'll be alone." Her small voice cracked into a scream. "Don't you understand? She'll die." She thrashed when Teresa reached out, panic twisting her body. The machines beeped wildly as Noah stirred awake, confusion lacing his bruised face. "Lila?" he croaked. His hand found hers, weak but insistent. "Don't go. Don't leave me." The room froze in the sound of that plea. Victor's chest clenched. All his life he had stood apart from chaos, using money and power as walls. He had built empires, silenced enemies, survived storms of finance and politics. But here, in a hospital room with two frightened children and a system that didn't bend for feelings, he found himself at the edge of a decision he could not delegate. He looked at Lila, eyes wet, hands trembling, clutching his son's fingers like a lifeline. He looked at the officers, steady in their duty, and in that silence he realized that walking away, as he had done so many times before, would crush something inside Noah that no doctor could repair. Victor Halloway had never been more powerful than he was in boardrooms, but at that moment, power meant something else, standing between a girl and the machinery that would strip her world apart. "I'll take responsibility," he said finally, his voice steady. "She stays." Angela Monroe's eyes flickered, surprised but not displeased. Teresa Diaz frowned, pen hovering over her clipboard. "Mr. Halloway, this isn't—" "It is now," Victor cut in. He stood, tall, commanding, the steel of his presence filling the room. "You want guardianship proof? I'll give it. You want safety? Look around. This is my word." The monitors hummed. Noah clutched tighter, and Lila's breath came ragged but steady. For the first time, Victor had chosen not the safe path, not the profitable one, but the human one. The truth stood naked in the room. This wasn't about reputation, nor wealth, nor power. It was about a child who had saved his son and refused to abandon her grandmother, and about whether Victor Halloway could finally step off his tower and into the dirt of the city that had always lived below his windows. The wood-paneled walls of the Wayne County family court rose high and heavy, their dark varnish meant to remind all who entered that justice had roots deeper than convenience. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing a sterile glow over tired faces and manila folders stacked like weary soldiers on desks. Victor Halloway sat rigid at the defendant's table, shoulders broad beneath a tailored navy suit that seemed out of place among the worn jackets and hand-me-down dresses of the families waiting their turns. The man who had once commanded skyscrapers and boardrooms now found himself staring at a judge's bench, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. Beside him sat Harold Whitman, his attorney. Harold was in his late 60s, a man with thinning white hair combed back so carefully it seemed pinned in place. His spectacles slid constantly down the bridge of his nose, and he had a habit of steepling his fingers as if every conversation were a sermon. Harold had built his career representing wealthy families through divorces, custody disputes, and inheritance wars. He was pragmatic to the bone, with little patience for sentiment. "Victor," he whispered as papers shuffled around them, "you don't want this. Taking responsibility for that girl will drag you through hearings, inspections, press nightmares. You've already done enough by bringing her story forward. Let the system handle her." Victor's jaw flexed. He thought of Noah lying in the alley, blood seeping into ice, breath shallow. He thought of the phone call, Lila's trembling voice refusing to let a stranger die alone. He thought of Noah's hand clinging to hers, even in sleep. "The system," Victor muttered under his breath, "hasn't been there for her. She was there for my son." Harold sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose, as if trying to squeeze reason into a man gone reckless. At the opposing table sat Assistant District Attorney Carla Simmons, a woman in her early 40s with sleek auburn hair pulled into a bun and a crisp gray suit that carried the scent of starch and determination. She had cut her teeth prosecuting cases of neglect and abuse, haunted by the memory of her younger sister who had been lost in foster care years ago. Carla's dark brown eyes held little patience for Billionaire's playing savior. She glanced at Victor like a chess piece already placed on the board. Behind her, Child Protective Services Supervisor Linda Graves waited with arms crossed. Linda was mid-50s, short, stocky, with salt and pepper curls and the kind of no-nonsense posture that made children straighten their backs instinctively. She had raised 3 foster kids of her own and seen too many fall through cracks. To her, caution wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Judge Miriam Cook entered the courtroom with the quiet authority of someone who had been weighing families against futures for 3 decades. She was in her late 60s, African American, tall and elegant despite the lines of age carved into her face. Her robe swept around her like a storm cloud, and her sharp gray eyes missed nothing. Once, long ago, she had been a civil rights lawyer fighting for children in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods. That fire had cooled into wisdom, but it still glowed. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The room shuffled to its feet. Judge Cook took her seat. "Be seated." Her gavel tapped lightly. "Case number 4271, the matter of temporary guardianship for minor Lila Carter." Victor's heart thudded against his ribs. Across the courtroom, Lila sat in a wooden chair far too large for her. Her red knit hat was clutched nervously in her lap, her thrift store coat swallowing her thin frame. Her eyes darted toward Victor and Noah, sitting together at the front, before she looked down at her scuffed sneakers. The proceedings began. Carla Simmons rose smoothly. "Your Honor, while we commend Mr. Halloway's concern, the state must question the wisdom of granting temporary guardianship of a vulnerable minor to a man already under immense public scrutiny. This child deserves stability, not headlines. Her grandmother, though ill, is her lawful guardian. Until her capacity is assessed, CPS recommends foster placement." Whispers rustled through the benches. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked like insects. Harold Whitman stood next. "Your Honor, Mr. Halloway's involvement is not opportunistic. Without Miss Carter, his son would not be alive. She demonstrated courage beyond her years. Mr. Halloway is willing to provide housing, medical care for her grandmother, and a stable environment until proper arrangements are confirmed." Judge Cook's gaze settled on Victor. "Mr. Halloway, you are one of the wealthiest men in this city. Why should this court believe your intentions are more than philanthropy dressed in sentiment?" Victor rose slowly, buttoning his jacket as though clinging to formality for balance. "Because," he said, voice steady but low, "I've spent my life building towers and forgetting the streets beneath them. Last night, my son nearly died in one of those streets. A child. Not the police, not an ambulance, not me, kept him alive. She stayed when no one else did. If I walk away now, I teach my son that loyalty means nothing, that people who save your life can be discarded. I won't teach him that." Silence rippled through the courtroom. Harold glanced up, surprised. Carla frowned, sensing the tide shift. And then came the moment Victor had not expected. From his chair, Noah stirred and rose, swaying slightly but determined. He was pale, bandaged, but his eyes were fierce with the clarity of children who see truths adults hide from. He stepped forward, dragging Lila with him by the hand. "Your Honor," Noah said, his voice trembling but loud enough to carry, "she saved me. If she wasn't there, I'd be dead. Don't send her away. If my dad doesn't keep her, if he doesn't protect her, then I won't forgive him. Ever." The words landed like thunder. Victor felt them strike the deepest places of his chest, places he had sealed after his wife's death, after years of pretending emotions were liabilities. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Cook leaned forward, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softening almost imperceptibly. Lila, standing beside Noah, looked both terrified and proud. Her small hand tightened around his. Victor closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the decision was already written in his face. "I choose her," he said firmly. The gavel struck once, echoing like a verdict larger than the case itself. The gavel's echo from Judge Cook's bench still lingered in Victor's memory as the weeks unfolded. The order had been clear: temporary guardianship of Lila Carter under Victor Halloway, until further review of her grandmother's condition and the legal arrangements surrounding her care. It was not final, not yet, but for the first time since that night in the alley, the horizon didn't feel so cold. Victor's townhouse on Willow Street, A sprawling three-story brick residence with ivy climbing the facade had once felt cavernous, a mausoleum for a man and his son living parallel lives under one roof. Now, with the arrival of Lila, the halls stirred with new sounds, the shuffle of small sneakers, the slam of a refrigerator door at odd hours, the hesitant laughter of children finding common ground. The first morning, Lila woke in a room she could not believe was hers. The walls were pale blue, sunlight spilling across a bed far too soft compared to the sagging couch she had shared with Edna. A bookshelf weighted with stories she had only ever glimpsed at school. On the windowsill, a pot of marigolds brightened the room, placed there by Mrs. Dorothy McAllister, the housekeeper. Dorothy was in her early 60s, stout and warm, with silver hair always tied in a bun and round cheeks that flushed when she laughed. She had been with the Halloways for years, loyal to the family even through Victor's darkest days. Having grown up one of 9 children in a poor Ohio household, Dorothy carried her own scars of scarcity. That past had made her fiercely protective of any child who crossed her path. She welcomed Lila with cinnamon rolls and an embrace so genuine it nearly broke the girl's defenses. "Eat, darling," Dorothy insisted, placing a plate in front of her. "You can't start a new life on an empty stomach." Meanwhile, Noah had begun to recover, his bruises fading to yellow-green. He remained quieter than usual, perhaps aware that his survival had been tethered to the girl now sharing his house. One afternoon, he knocked on Lila's door with a board game under his arm. "Want to play?" he asked shyly. She hesitated, unused to boys offering anything but trouble, then nodded. Their laughter soon spilled through the halls, and Dorothy, listening from the kitchen, wiped her eyes on her apron. Victor, watching from the study doorway, felt something stir. He had not heard that kind of sound in his home since his wife had died. Yet the transition was not seamless. Lila often woke in the night, startled by the silence of the wealthy home compared to the noisy hum of her neighborhood. She sometimes hoarded snacks under her bed, fearful that the food might vanish. Victor noticed and, rather than scold, quietly asked Dorothy to keep fruit and granola bars in a basket near Lila's room so she would never feel the need to hide hunger again. Meanwhile, Edna Carter's condition had improved under new care. Victor had arranged for Dr. Grace Whitmore, a home health physician, to visit twice weekly. Grace was in her 50s, tall and lean, with silver hair cut in a neat bob and a no-nonsense manner softened by kind eyes. Years earlier, she had lost her husband to cancer and had turned her grief into dedication to elder care, believing no family should feel abandoned by the medical system. With Victor's funding, Edna received proper medication, fresh groceries, and a mobility aid. Slowly, her cough lessened, her energy returned. On Saturdays, Victor's car brought Lila to Edna's apartment. Their reunions were tearful but hopeful, Edna embracing her granddaughter, whispering prayers of thanks. At first, Edna was wary of Victor's intentions, but as weeks passed and she saw the light returning to Lila's eyes, she softened. "You've done more for her than I could," she told him once, her voice raspy but sincere. "For that, I'll be grateful, no matter what happens." The press, hungry for scandal, had shifted their attention elsewhere. Evelyn Grant, ever the strategist, had carefully steered the narrative away from suspicion, framing Victor's actions as private compassion rather than public theater. Brian Keller, the reporter who had first tried to paint the story as staged, wrote a reluctant follow-up admitting that sometimes wealth bends not for profit, but for humanity. The city, skeptical but moved, began to whisper a different story about the Halloways. And through it all, Noah and Lila grew inseparable. They argued like siblings over chores, competed fiercely in board games, and discovered a shared love of sketching. Noah with precise lines, Lila with wild colors. Dorothy would often find them sprawled on the living room rug, their laughter rising like a hymn. One evening, as snow fell outside, Victor stood on the front porch with both children. He wore his long wool coat, Noah bundled in a blue scarf, and Lila in a new red jacket Dorothy had insisted on buying. Together they looked out over Willow Street, its lampposts glowing, the snow-dusted rooftops gleaming under holiday lights. Victor placed a hand on each of their shoulders. For the first time, the townhouse no longer felt like a mausoleum, but like a hearth. He saw not just his son, but a family remade from broken pieces. Lila leaned against him shyly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the street. "I never thought I'd have a place like this," she whispered. Victor swallowed hard, his throat thick. "It's your place now," he said. And as they stood there, the city humming softly around them, the truth became clear. A call made from a freezing alley had not only saved a boy's life, but had awakened a father's heart. It was not wealth nor power that had changed the Halloways. It was one girl's refusal to walk away. Sometimes the smallest act of courage can change everything. Lila was just a little girl with nothing to her name but a cracked phone and a brave heart. Yet her decision to stay, to make that call, transformed lives forever. In our own daily lives, we often walk past people who are hurting, or we convince ourselves that someone else will step in. But true change begins when we refuse to look away, when we choose compassion over convenience. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and if you believe in the power of love and second chances, type Amen below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of courage, kindness, and redemption. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and light.